G'day guys! Today I want to share with you some content that was originally recorded as a seminar for a Team Australia fundraiser event that I hosted at the gaming arena, where basically we had an RTT fundraiser event that was followed by a live seminar and Q&A session where I basically talked through some various tips, strategies, tactics and stuff like that to share my experience from the WTC with the community. And this is something that we're planning to do at our upcoming fundraiser events as well, with different guests such as Jeremy Martino, Matt Morrisoli, Reese Cunningham, all putting their experience out there for you to basically participate in and enjoy. And as this seminar was something that I delivered personally, I thought it would be a good idea to then basically recap that here on YouTube for you guys at home. So with that being said, let's get into the video.
Look for the blood god.
Are you tired of overkilling or underkilling enemy units? Tired of wasting time deciding how many attacks to allocate to achieve a desired outcome? And are you tired of complicated maths, calculating multiple weapon profiles with complex special rules? Well, thanks to today's sponsor, all of those problems are problems of the past. Adept Roll allows you to input the profile of your attacking units and the profile of the units they are attacking into to calculate expected results with precision. You can apply modifiers like Feel No Pain, -1 to hit, damage reduction, as well as enemy strats like Armor of Contempt to get precise results for what you expect your units to do on the tabletop. By rapidly simulating 1,000 rolls, Adept Roll will help you understand what your expected results are likely to be in any given tabletop situation. You can even save attacker or defender profiles to make data entry super fast and super simple, as well as importing them from various sources like Battlescribe or even screenshots from the Games Workshop app itself. So if you're looking to upskill, play like a pro, and stop making avoidable mistakes on the tabletop, download Adept Roll today and start playing with precision. Okay, so today the main topic that I will be covering is command points. We're going to be really deep diving this critical component of the game, and this is something that I've been doing a lot of lately that I think people are getting a lot of benefits from, and that is picking one very niche specific topic and really deep diving on it. There's tons of content out there that'll give you really big high level overviews of things, but they don't really dig into the nuances of the very specific components of 40k. So that's something that I'm hoping to do here. I'd love your feedback in the comments section. Let me know what you guys think of this video and let me know if you enjoy this as a format. But with that being said, let's talk about command points, right? So the first thing to note is that Warhammer 40k is a resource management game. That's the name of the game. So this is really important, and once you understand that, it'll allow you to sort of comprehend certain components of the game in a much more strategic manner. So we're all familiar with points costs as a resource, right? So this is the amount of points that a unit costs. You spend those resources, you get that unit in your army. So we're all familiar with that side of the resource management game, but there's a few things that we don't consider anywhere near as much as we probably should, and these are really important resources that you have available to you in a game of Warhammer 40k. One of those is your units. During the game, your units are a resource. You can now forget how many points they cost. You've got your units, that's what you have in front of you. Your opponent has their units, and you basically engage in a resource war where you can either trade your units for an objective or victory points, or you can trade one of your units for one of their units. So for example, I'm going to charge that unit, kill them off an objective, but I know that I'm going to get killed in return, so it's kind of a trade. And this is all facilitated by viewing the units as resources that you can use. Another one is time. There's only a set amount of time in a game of 40k, so you've got to make sure that you're using your time wisely. And once you realize that time is a resource that you can spend, you start realizing that maybe it's better to spend a little bit more during your command phase planning out your turn, and a little bit less on the nuances of a pile-in or something later on in the game, because the time that you spend creating a solid plan is often going to yield much better results than the time deciding in your shooting phase how many attacks you put into a certain target, for example. So when you realize time is a resource, that allows you to go, well, where do I want to spend that resource? Another one that people often overlook is your attention. What are you paying attention to? You can't pay attention to absolutely everything, and often the areas where you have a lapse in your attention is where you fall down. So making sure that you're paying attention in the right areas of the game at the right times, paying attention to the right unit. You might be spending all this time trying to figure out how to kill their Death Star, and as a result you ignore all of their little units that are running around achieving objectives. So that's an example of you paying attention to the wrong thing, spending your attention in an unwise manner. But the main thing that I want to talk about today is command points. Now, these are a very obvious resource. You generate them throughout the game. You can spend them for various stratagems. So it's very obvious that these are a resource. But learning how to manage this resource is going to see dramatic improvements in your games. So let's get stuck into talking about command points. So the first thing that you need to do, this is so important, is develop a command point budget. And this is basically going to be a plan for what you want to do in this particular matchup with your command points. You want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that at the start of the game, and then making sure that you stick to that budget. So one of the really easy ways that you can do this is in every command phase, after you draw your cards, sit there and just give yourself a minute or two on your clock. If you're playing on a chess clock, just go, cool, look at the clock, it's at 1:58. By the time it's 1:56, I want to have made this decision. So don't allow yourself to procrastinate on it for too long, but do allow yourself that amount of time in your command phase to come up with a plan for the next 2 turns specifically related to command points. So we all sit there in our command phase and think, oh, how am I going to achieve these cards? What am I going to do? Blah, blah, blah. But sit there and also think, well, I've just generated a CP. What am I going to do with the CP that I currently have? And what do I want to do in the future turns? And how many CP is that going to cost? And you basically revise your budget every command phase. And this is really, really important way of making sure that you stay on track. This could be something as simple as you're versing a combat army, you start with 0 CP, you know that in their turn 1, they're going to want to charge you across multiple fronts. So what you do is you move your army out, you don't spend the CP that you generate, then in the start of their turn, you'll generate another one, you don't spend that one either, and now you have 2 command points, which means you're able to interrupt if they charge you in multiple places at once. So this is a really effective example of budgeting. You've gone, I'm looking at their army, looking at my army, I know they're going to want to engage me on multiple fronts with combat, so I'm going to save my CP, I'm going to budget, so that in their turn, I will be able to interrupt. There's lots of examples of that, but that's a really good example of budgeting, and that's something that you'd make that decision in your command phase. In your turn, you generate none, in their turn, you generate 1, and then you go into the situation where you would spend them to interrupt. And then after that happens, you'll tick into your next command phase, and that's when you go, cool, now let's make a budget for this battle round. Another really important thing is sticking to your budget. This is something that I have been personally guilty of countless times, where you'll come up with a really good budget, you'll come up with a plan, this is what I want to do, and then in that first turn, you'll fail a charge. Or you'll roll a 1 on the d6 damage of your weapon, or something like that. And then you go, I'll CP reroll that. I'll reroll that charge, or I'll reroll that 1. And then, because you look at it, you've got the CP, you can afford to do it, so you do it. And then it ticks over your opponent's turn, and you're like, oh no, I was supposed to save that CP so that I could interrupt, but now I can't do it because I didn't stick to my budget. So sticking to your budget's really important. You can write it down if that helps. You can put markers down if that helps. For me, it's just emotionally committing to whatever the budget is and specifically telling myself, no, you will not do any other strats. You've got 2 CP there. You've got 1 CP there, but you're not allowed to spend it. It takes a lot of self-control, but if you can master that, that's very, very helpful. Next, we have banking your CP. So in that same sort of example where you're not spending your CP in your turn, you're not spending the one that you generate in their turn, which means you have 2 CP, you've banked them so that you can threaten to use a stratagem that's a very expensive stratagem, like the 2 command points that's required to interrupt the combat sequence. if you do that, often you actually won't need to spend the CP. And this is one of the reasons why I view the command points as a resource, because often if you have lots of resources, you win without having to spend any resources. It's like a positive feedback loop, because basically what happens is if you have those 2 command points in your opponent's turn, in the start of their turn, they're going to go, oh, I actually can't charge him in 2 different places, because if I do, he's going to interrupt. So then your opponent doesn't charge you in 2 places, so therefore you don't spend those 2 command points on that interruption. And then when it ticks over into your turn, you're going to generate a 3rd command point, and now you've got a big bank full of CP. And that is so powerful, because then, you might spend a couple in your turn doing some damage dealing strats or something like that, but you make sure you keep one at the end of your turn, so that at the start of their turn, you generate an additional command point, so now you're on 2 again, and your opponent goes, oh, I still can't charge him in 2 different places at once, because he's going to interrupt. And as a result, you can basically just keep that gravy train going, and because your opponent can't interact with you in that manner, often you don't need to spend those command points. Another example could be something as simple as like an Armor of Contempt, where your opponent goes, okay, cool, he's going to Armor of Contempt, which means what I need to do is I need to hit him with so much that I would kill him even through Armor of Contempt, right? So now because the fact that you have the command point and you could spend it on that defensive stratagem, your opponent then overcommits so that if you did go defensive, he would still die. And now you don't have to go defensive because you're going to die anyway. So you keep the command point, and now your opponent's just wasted a whole ton of damage into your unit. Same goes with the World Eaters with the -1 damage in fight phase strat, things like that, where your opponent goes, okay, cool, that big unit of Terminators or that big unit of 8-bound, they're going to be -1 damage, so I'm going to need to throw in a ridiculous amount of combat if I want to kill them, or I need to just not charge them at all. And realistically, either one of those scenarios you're happy with, because if they just don't charge you at all, well, having those 2 command points kept you alive. And if they do charge you with absolutely everything, then you don't spend the 2 command points, but you die, but it took their entire army, and now the entire army is exposed, it's within charge range of various ones of your threats. Banking your CP is a really good way of really getting the miles out of them. The next one is discarding your tactical cards in order to generate additional command points. Now this one's obviously really good because, and we'll talk about the value of a command point in a moment, but CP is so highly valuable that if there's ever a card that you're not able to achieve, you want to basically discard that and generate command points. And even sometimes if both of your cards are achievable, you're going to want to discard one of those cards to generate a command point anyway. And one of the advantages of doing this is sometimes if you're versing a sophisticated opponent, they don't only budget for their own command points, but they'll be keeping track of your budget, and they'll be keeping track of how many command points you have. And if you get into a situation where they think you're going to score both of your cards, but then you don't, you intentionally discard one that was scoreable, like let's say cleanse, instead of going out and cleansing 2 objectives, you just go out and cleanse 1, or instead of cleansing 1 at all, so say there's a situation where you could only cleanse 1, instead of cleansing it and getting those 2 victory points, you just don't cleanse at all, discard the CP, discard the card, and now you get an additional CP that your opponent wasn't expecting you to generate. That can be really, really powerful as well. And then the final one is CP batteries. Any unit that you can take in your army that has the capacity to generate command points is really, really valuable. And again, we'll talk about the value of a CP and how to sort of ascertain that in a moment. But suffice to say, if you can get something in your army that has the capacity to generate command points, it's always worth looking into. Now, some of them are a bit iffy, where it's like you have to be in your opponent's deployment zone, you have to have killed something, you have to roll a 5+, some of them are a bit iffy and definitely not worth considering. But generally speaking, especially the ones that are really reliable, they're definitely things you want to include in your list.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.
Alright, so now let's talk about the value of a CP. And this is probably the most critical component of understanding CP as a resource, because obviously, there's pretty obvious what the value of points are when generating your list. The value of those points is the units that you get. However, ascertaining the value of a CP can be a little bit more difficult. So the best way I find to do this is to find what I call translatable strats. So an example of this for the World Eaters players out there is the stratagem that allows you to sticky an objective when you die, right? So there'll be a situation where you'll throw your jackals out onto an objective or something like that. Your opponent fires a volley of guns into them, kills your jackals. Now, because it's their shooting phase, they can't move again, so therefore they can't get on that objective, which means if, when you die, you spend the CP, you sticky it, let's say you're playing take and hold, that means that the objective is still under your control. It immediately then ticks over into your command phase, and you're going to generate 5 victory points. So you can look at it as that's 1 CP to generate 5 victory points. That's a direct translation, right? And almost every faction has a stratagem that's like this. It may not be directly related to sticking an objective, but there's often a stratagem that you can look at where you're like, utilizing this stratagem now in this way will directly translate to victory points, right? And when you do that, you then have a bit of a benchmark for how many victory points each command point is worth. And that's basically what I'm talking about here with the value of a command point. So as a World Eaters player, I generally put that benchmark at each command point needs to generate you 5 victory points. Now, obviously, this is going to vary from faction to faction. Some factions have some stratagems that are absolutely insane and will generate you lots of victory points. Some of them have no really good stratagems. Some of them have the ability to generate more command points, so therefore there's more supply, so therefore it's not as important that they generate as much value because you have so many of them. And other factions don't have the ability to generate command points, in which case every command point needs to be worth more. So there's a lot to factor in there. But as a general benchmark, I think roughly 5 victory points per command point is pretty reasonable. So now what we want to do, that we've figured out that 5 victory points is the value of a CP, we want to compare stratagems. So an example could be you've got 1 CP to sticky an objective, that gets you 5 victory points. So you might have another 1 CP stratagem to auto-advance 6 inches. Now, you might draw Storm Hostile Objective. And now you realize, well, hang on, all I need to do is take my 5 Berserkers, move them, auto-advance them 6, and that'll get me on that objective, which means I'm going to get my 4 victory points for Storming Hostile, and I'm going to deny my opponent that objective, so I'm going to take 5 victory points off them. That's a 9-point swing. That's a really good value use of command points, because it's higher than your benchmark. Whereas another example might be something like, I've got somebody coming in and they're going to hit me, my 8-bound, and I'm going to spend 2 command points in order to keep my 8-bound alive. But if they do so and they hit you and they kill you down to 1 or 2 8-bound left, and then those 8-bound don't really do much, it's like, well, you just spent 2 command points, and that should have translated into roughly 10 victory points, but it didn't. It translated into nothing. So there's a few ways that you can sort of conceptualize that, but basically once you establish your benchmark with your translatable stratagems, and then you can compare the various stratagems, you'll pretty quickly realize which stratagems you want to use and which ones you don't, and it'll make it a lot faster on the game. You'll spend a lot less time umming and ahhing. It's also worth factoring in the chances here. So a good example of this could be something like if you're going to charge somebody that's on an objective, let's say you're 7 inches away and you fail the charge, right? You could spend 1 command point to re-roll that charge, and you've got roughly a 50% chance of making it in, right? If that's only going to generate you 5 victory points, you probably don't do it, because 50% of the 5 victory points is only 5, which is 2.5, sorry, which is not great. Whereas if you go, well, hang on, if I make that charge, I got a 50% chance of making it. If I make the charge, I'm going to deny him 5 victory points. I'm going to gain 5 victory points myself, and I'm going to delete one of his units that would otherwise still be alive. Well, now you look at it and you're like, well, that's worth 10 plus victory points, so it's worth spending the 1 CP, even though it only has a 50% chance of succeeding. You know, there's obviously some things where it gets a little bit harder to ascertain the value, like maybe it's +1 to wound when attacking a certain target. It's like, well, it's not going to directly translate into command points. However, down the line it might, you know. So it's easy if it's like you've got bring it down and you're charging a vehicle, well, then you can figure out, yes, that will directly translate into victory points. But, you know, if it's just trying to clear one of your opponent's units that's out in the open, it's not on an objective, but it's a scary unit that you really want to kill, it can be harder to sort of figure those things out. My rule of thumb there is that if it's early in the game, you get a lot more value out of killing things, because if you kill it in turn 1, it's not alive at all. Whereas if you wait until turn 3 to kill something, turns 1 and 2, that unit was running around killing stuff. So getting kills earlier in the game is often more valuable, in which case spending command points to secure those kills earlier in the game is often very valuable, whereas spending them later in the game is less valuable. There's also strats that you can get for free. So this is things like if you've got a Chaos Lord that allows you to get free stratagem access or discounted stratagem access. This is something that should be very highly considered, because if we've established that each command point should be roughly 5 victory points, well, if you have 3 Chaos Lords in your list and each one has access to a free stratagem every battle round, well, now all of a sudden you're going to be generating a ton more victory points because you're going to have access to stratagems cheaply. So that's a really, really important thing to note. And the other one is strat-like abilities. So this is things like if your unit has built-in reroll charges, right? These are things that are worth considering, because if you have built-in reroll charges, the chances of you needing to spend your command points to reroll a charge is very unlikely. So there's lots of units in the game that have abilities on their data sheets that are very similar to something that you would get from a stratagem. So it's worth considering them as if they were a stratagem built into your list. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Hi, I'm Dean Simbeck, President and CEO of Blog for the Blood God's exclusive high-quality dice warehouse and emporium. Due to a shipping error, I'm currently overstocked with Blog for the Blood God exclusive high-quality dice, and I'm passing the savings on to you! Roll 9-inch charges, pass invulnerable saves, roll high for damage, and score lots of hits. Check out the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about taxing your opponent, because it's all well and good to manage your own command points and have your own budget and sticking to it and understanding the value of command point. But the next level on top of that is looking at your opponent's command points and going out of your way to negatively impacting their economy, their budget, their resources, right? This is a really, really important thing to note, because if you're looking at your command points thinking, I can translate any one of those into 5 victory points by using one of my various stratagems, your opponent's probably doing the same thing. So if you can knock out their command points, you can then prevent them from using them to generate victory points. So this is a really important skill to master. There's a few ways that you can do this. One of them is with Vect or any other things that tax your opponent's CP directly. So things like Fate Weaver, things like Cypher, the Dark Elder, Archons, There's tons of them in the game. Most factions have access to one or two of them. Some unlikely factions don't, like World Eaters. We don't have it. But it's something that if you do have access to it, I highly recommend taking it. And that's for a few reasons. One is the obvious that it's going to cost your opponents more CP. They're going to run out of CP earlier, and therefore they're not going to be able to use those CP to directly translate into victory points. But another one is that it's going to throw out your opponent's budget. So if they've budgeted for being able to, say, interrupt, say it's their turn 1, they got first turn, they didn't spend their command point, then it ticks over into your turn, they've generated a second command point, and they're like, haha, you can't charge me in 2 different places with your Chaos Space Marines. And you go, well, Cypher jumps out, and now interrupting is going to cost you 3 command points, and then I charge my Chosen into this, my Possessed into that, and your opponent can't interrupt anymore. So even though your opponent has budgeted wisely for the ability to use a certain stratagem, your units that tax your opponent's command points are going to really mess with their budget, which is such an amazingly powerful tool in your arsenal. Another really good one is bait and traps. So being able to do things like, move a unit of jackals out and ask your opponent, oh, would you like to overwatch here? And if your opponent goes, oh, here, right, I will overwatch there. It's like, cool, well now that you've spent your 1 command point on overwatch, you can't spend it on a heroic intervention over here, and now I'm going to charge in this unit, wipe out something that you would have otherwise been able to interact with. So being able to go, cool, I'm going to bait you by sending out something that's attempting overwatch, so that your opponent then wastes their command points on something that doesn't directly translate into victory points, preventing them from later spending them on something that would, is amazingly powerful. That's an example of like a bait or a trap that you can set for your opponent that is focused around attacking their resources. Another really good one is you can charge 2 units in that you don't really care about, and then bait your opponent to spend 2 command points interrupting, and you're basically trading one of your units for 2 of their command points. And there's plenty of incidences where you'd probably rather them not have those 2 command points, because then in their next turn, they're not going to be able to rapid ingress, or they're not going to be able to, do whatever other tricks that they have access to. So being able to bait your opponent into situations like that is really, really powerful. These are all just different scenarios that you can create that are going to really make nightmare situations for your opponent, where not only are you going to be taxing their command points, but you're also taxing the other resources that we mentioned at the start of the game. You're taxing their attention, you're taxing their time, you're taxing their mental bandwidth, because all of a sudden you're creating these hard scenarios where they need to really think and focus, and meanwhile you're just going off and doing your other thing. So the example of throwing out a unit that you're not really caring about to bait out an Overwatch is really good, because now they're going to spend so much time thinking about, do I want to Overwatch? How many CP do I have? What's my plan with those CP? If they're spending that much time there, it's entirely possible that they're going to forget that their initial plan was to heroically intervene with this unit over here. So creating those scenarios is really important. And finally, I just want to talk about how 40k is a war of resources. So we've already talked about the resource management side of things, but I think it's really important to touch on this. So, like solid army lists, for example, that's something that's really easy to get access to these days. There's plenty of apps that you can use to find those really exciting army lists. You can watch tournament results, and you can look at what's working well elsewhere in the world. You can watch articles, you can watch YouTube videos like the ones that I produce, where I have like my top 5 CSM lists or whatever, and finding a really powerful list, that's really easy to do, and it's something that everybody can do, right? Another one is tactics. There's plenty of videos out there like mine, there's plenty of videos online for various content creators that basically break down all of the standard tactics, right? And also 10th edition 40k is relatively simple in that front. There's not a massive amount of complexity on where you move models, how you move models, how certain rules interact with each other. A lot of it's very streamlined, which is very good, because it means that, it's easier for new players. But one of the things that does is it makes it harder for you to create a point of difference between you and your opponent that allows you to gain an advantage and win the game. So talking about the point of difference, basically, if you're looking at this and you're going, well, pretty much everybody at this tournament that I'm at has a really strong list, and everybody at this tournament is a competent player. They know what they're doing, right? Well, how am I going to create a point of difference that's going to result in me winning the event as opposed to them? That can be really hard to do. And one of the ways that I recommend doing that is mastering this war of resources. Once you realize that, that's something that a lot of people will overlook. A lot of people are not very skilled at it. And when you become skilled at it, you start seeing games as a lot easier and a lot more reasonable, and your opponents become a lot easier to conquer when you've mastered the art of war on resources when your opponent hasn't. And essentially, all wars, as far as I'm concerned, are resource-based. Whether they be real-life wars between actual nations, or whether they be wars on the tabletop, they're all resource-based. And generally speaking, whoever has the better resources and the better skills and talents in utilizing their resources is going to generate much better results. So managing those resources is the path to victory more often than not. And often when you look back at a game, you'll be like, I know what went wrong. I spent my CP too fast. Or, I know what went wrong. I didn't capitalize on early opportunities to spend my command points because I was being too conservative. So, understanding the resources, understanding how to spend them, by knowing what their value is, knowing what your budget is, and using that is going to get you much better results than if you just sort of play reactively and just go, cool, well, I guess I have this many CP, I guess I could spend them on that. My opponent's put me in this situation which now completely changes my plan. If you're being reactive like that with your resources, your opponent is going to be able to basically bully you around the table and take advantage of that resource disparity. So that's essentially what I have to say on resources and command points. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, like, subscribe, comment, head over to blogforthebloodgod.com for more information on how you can show support for the channel, including going over to my Etsy store and picking up dice, neoprene objective markers, 3D printed miniatures. I've got all kinds of goodies over there. You can also join the Patreon and the Discord server where we talk tactics and strategies, and we also have people that put input into what videos I talk about in the future. So that's a really awesome place, really awesome community over there. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in, guys. This was a seminar that was delivered live at a Team Australia fundraiser event, so if you want to jump in and check one of those out, you can be part of the conversation, you can ask questions live, and then we can basically provide that feedback. So that's basically what we're talking about here. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Wanted to show you these really cool blessings trackers by warhammerstation.com. If you'd like to pick up one, you can do so by commenting below with what you would like to see added to the blessings table. So which ability would you like to see if you could create another one yourself? So for example, you could have a reroll charges if you're able to roll 333+. Or you might have something like +1 to charge army-wide if you roll 2 5s. So give me your idea on what you think would make a really cool additional blessing, and then I'm going to select one person from that comment section and I'm going to send them out one of these blessings trackers. So if you want to enter the draw to get one of these in your hands, all you got to do is chuck that comment below.